welcome to this second seminar in INNATE's two events on Irish peace movement history. Last week we were dealing with Northern Ireland, and the video of that talk is online. And this week we look at international peace issues and work which has been done in Ireland on that. And part of the reason for the seminar is marking the centenary of the War Resisters International, which INNATE is linked with. However, I did want to say that there is a strong link between, if you like, last week and this week. The people who have been involved in working for peace in Northern Ireland have had a tough time. But if people who are involved in international peace issues had an event in somewhere in Northern Ireland, perhaps at Belfast City Hall, on an international issue, a war, a rumor of war, a disaster of some kind, whatever, a passerby, not inevitably, but often there would be a passerby who would see that we were vigiling or demonstrating on an international issue and would say, why are you not involved in Northern Ireland issues? And of course, if you looked at the faces who were there, every single person there was involved with local Northern Ireland issues. So there is a strong link in terms of personnel in the context of Northern Ireland. But here we're talking in an All-Ireland context, and there are more speakers from south of the border, south and west of the border, if you like, than north of the border. And it is a strange time because the political elite, if you like, in Dublin and the Republic are gunning, working their damnedest to get rid of Irish neutrality. And Belfast in Northern Ireland sees increased military research and development on drones and laser weapons, in addition to Tally's existing production of missiles for sale to all comers. Our speakers this evening come from different groups and backgrounds, but all have been rowing together. And we should say that including our last speaker, Sylvia Thompson, in the mix was a deliberate recognition, not just of her as an activist, but of the way in which the ecological crisis is already a dire threat to the peace and well-being of the world. It's not being dealt with in this seminar, but you should have, if you had booked directly and received a little publication on peace groups in Ireland, if you like, a chronological account of peace groups in Ireland, which we're looking to get updated. So that's not for discussion in this seminar. But if you haven't received a copy and would like one, you can put your name and address in the chat, or send INNATE an email. You are very welcome to use the chat facility to make comments and questions. And we have asked our speakers to keep to 10 minutes, and they will receive a notification after 8 minutes. So it's not us being rude to them, it's to keep to the 10 minutes so we have time for the discussion groups afterwards. I'll talk about the discussion groups afterwards, but I think we can go straight into the first speaker. And I'm delighted to have as our first speaker Joe Murray of Afri, who is based in Dublin, but Joe is a native of County Longford and has worked for Afri since 1982, during which time Afri has completed projects in a wide variety of areas concerning justice at home and abroad. And Afri is one of the few, or very few, NGOs who identify militarization and war as major obstacles to development. And it incorporates this theme in its work with schools, colleges, and the general public. So I'm delighted to welcome Joe to talk. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everyone who's here. And please remind me if you can't hear, because I speak with us in soft tones, I'm told, so you can indicate if you're having difficulty hearing me. I'm glad to have this opportunity. I think it's a great idea to have this, celebration of peace movements in Ireland, North and South. I think we don't often enough, I suppose, look at the successes or celebrate what has been achieved, and that's understandable given the challenges that face us. I suppose tonight I feel is particularly significant in the sense that the Irish government tomorrow are holding their first arms fair, you could call it, well, it was meant to be in the Aviva Stadium, but it has now been transferred online. So that's happening tomorrow. It's a very retrograde, depressing step, but I'd encourage anyone who can make a phone call or send an email or whatever tomorrow to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, who is opening this event, to do so. In terms of what I want to talk about, I suppose it's about development education, which I've been involved in for a long time, is about connecting the local and the global. And as Ian said, one of the things that Afri does is includes militarization as one of the key components or key obstacles to development, and tries to address that. But it's not an easy issue to address, and maybe that's why so many groups don't do it. So many groups in the area of development don't do it. The person who, I suppose, alerted to us to this first was Sean McBride, who was a special advisor to Afri in the early years. And when we were set up in order to respond to hunger in the global south, which was the reason we came into existence, Sean McBride consistently said, if you're concerned about hunger, you also have to be concerned about war and weapons. And initially I didn't see that link, but now I cannot avoid seeing it wherever I look. As I say, it's a difficult issue to raise, particularly if you're working with young people, or as we do in second level and third level. But the issue, or the idea I want to talk about, may be familiar to some of you, but not all of you. But I think it is a creative initiative and a creative way of tackling a very difficult and burdensome issue. It's an initiative that Afri began in 1991 to coincide with the first Gulf War, or the Gulf War as it was called. I had just returned from working in Sudan at that time. I was conscious of the extreme poverty there in the area where I was working, in a place called Renk. And I was working with, living in a house with two Irish people, one of whom was a doctor. And every night after her day's work, she went out to the little shed which was attached to the house, and she saw children. Mothers brought their children to her, and she stayed there until midnight often. And she came in completely frustrated and exhausted, saying, the only thing that's wrong with all these children is lack of clean water. And it used to occur to me, why can we not, find a solution to this simple problem, the problem of clean water, given the military budget that existed at the time? Then in 1991, the Gulf War started, and with ultimate ease, this great military force was assembled without any question of cost or anything else. This incredible array of military artillery was assembled. And it occurred to us, how quickly the world responds when war is the issue, and how slow we are to respond to real issues of concern, like hunger, lack of clean water, and lack of health care. So we started an initiative called Just a Second, and the idea of that was to calculate how much the arms industry cost every second. So it was just a second. The idea, stop to think just a second, and then to calculate how much the arms trade cost every second, and to raise that amount of money with young people in schools. And the amount of money at that time, it was £20,000. It was Irish pounds then. So with young people, we raised that amount of money, and we used it to fund projects, anti-poverty projects in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and at home in Ireland. And the idea was to demonstrate this is what we could do with a tiny percentage of the arms budget, with one second of the arms budget, we funded 26 projects. Imagine what you could do if you used 5% or 10% or 50% or even 100%. So it was a creative and imaginative way, I suppose, of getting this very difficult message across. We did it again in the early noughties, by which time the per second expenditure on weapons had increased from 20,000 euro to 35,000, or from 20,000 pounds to 35,000 euro. And today it is in the region of 55,000 euro per second. It's $19.8 billion. That's what is spent annually on the arms industry. It is an absolute obscenity, and it is extraordinary that it is not on the top of the agenda of everybody who's concerned about development or the welfare of our planet. You know, in the COP26, it wasn't even mentioned, which is shocking and extraordinary that this element is left out of discussion and left out of the equation. And then the first thing that the Irish government do on their return from COP26 is to organise an arms fair in the Aviva Stadium. Like, you couldn't write the script. It is so unbelievable. So that's how am I on time, Rob?
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. You've some minutes left yet. Yeah.
So anyway, just to say that we did that with young people in schools, and then subsequently we produced a range of material. I have examples of it here. Different publications on the issue, just a second, under that title, and these are available to schools. And we have a program of work with 8 secondary schools, or 10 secondary schools now, and 3 universities, in which we explore these issues with young people each year. Sometimes you're, disappointed that it doesn't seem to, the penny doesn't seem to drop, but I think we felt the same for many years about climate change, and then due to Greta Thunberg and others, the penny did drop, and we hope the same thing will happen, and that people will make the connection between war and militarization and the threat to our planet. So that's the one issue. The second I want to touch on very quickly, it's another local, global issue. It's a campaign that I was very privileged to be involved with. And many of you may know a man called Tom Hyland, who was a bus driver in Ballyfermot. And one night he was watching television and he saw a program about the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. And he began what for me is the most extraordinary campaign that I've ever been involved in, the East Timor Ireland Solidarity Campaign. He had no experience of campaigning. In fact, he said that he used to pass ourselves protesting at the US Embassy or the British Embassy, and he, as a bus driver, he used to lower the window and shout out at us, "Plonkers, go home." So, but he had a conversion, and he learned about Timor, and he gave up his job and he devoted himself to the cause of East Timor. And it was
another 2 minutes there now, Joe. Okay.
Okay, I'll come to an end. Just one example was when Paul Keating, the Prime Minister of Australia, came expecting a nostalgic homecoming to Ireland. He was greeted with a large protest about Australia's policies in East Timor, then called East Timor. And just the last point then, there was a critical moment after the people of East Timor voted for independence, and the militias were sent in by the Indonesian military, and the people were driven to the mountains, and it looked like all was lost. But Bertie Ahern, who was Taoiseach at the time, asked Tom what he could do to help, and Tom said, "Open doors for us in Washington." And 2 delegates were sent to Washington and to persuade the US to support a peacekeeping force to be sent into East Timor. And that happened. And it was that peacekeeping force that made the difference between the survival of the peaceful revolution in East Timor and its demise. So amazing campaign from one person really, and supported by many others. But a sign of hope as to what people can achieve when committed and driven and using creative methodologies. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing those very interesting details. The Afri website address I've put up on chat, but it's easy to find anyway. There should be no difficulty in finding Afri. We now move on to our second speaker, who's John Lannon. John has been a lecturer in the University of Limerick and is currently working as CEO of Doris, a Limerick organisation working for the rights of people from a refugee or migrant background. He has been centrally involved with Shannonwatch, which monitors foreign military use of Shannon Airport, contrary to Irish neutrality. So, John, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. I hope you can hear me okay there, that I'm coming across okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Grand, good. I went to school in Longford, possibly the same school as Joe. So nice little segue there between us. I'm not sure if I learned to sound like he did, but
what school? Very quickly, tell me.
St. Mel's.
The very one.
I thought so. All right, I'm going to take a bit of a personal journey in my contribution. As I was preparing, I started thinking about, how the scale of avoidable violence in the world is one of the things that angers me the most. And of course, that's strictly linked to the production of ever increasing amounts of lethal weapons. And obscenity is what Joe said it was, and it absolutely is, yeah. And the problem for me is that the magnitude of the problem is so great that I find it's hard sometimes to get the energy that's needed to do something about it. And in the context of all this, the peace movement can sometimes feel a bit pointless, and I end up asking myself, how can we compete against dictators and fascists and corporations and trillion-dollar military budgets? It would certainly be easier to give up, or maybe to start another war, even a small one. So what is it that keeps me going? It's generally, I guess, looking into the eyes of people whose world have been torn apart by war or by oppression or persecution. And that stirs a different emotion very often. And for me, it's one that's more real and it's more immediate, and it's something that I can respond to. So I haven't been to a war zone, or I haven't experienced firsthand what it's like to live in one, or with the fear and the trauma of being in one. But I have been in places that were ravaged by poverty, which is also a form of oppression. And I've met people who have fled from persecution and from war. And I was thinking, and there were three meetings, I guess, that come to mind. And I'm just going to mention each of the three of them here. The first one was around 15 years ago, and I was sitting in an air-conditioned SUV in Dhaka, capital of Bangladesh. There were three other people in the car. The traffic was stalled, and as any of you have ever been to Dhaka will know, that's not unusual. It's very often just moves at a snail's pace. But the woman with a small baby came to the door, and she was pleading, and she was just pleading for something, for anything. And she was clearly destitute. And the companions that were in the car with me, there were local people, and they were all good people, but they shook their heads when I went to lower the window, and they said, "Don't, we'll be surrounded if you do." And I didn't. It's amazing that her face has actually stayed with me. And every time I hear about the trillions of dollars that have been spent on weapons, I think of her for some reason. The other meeting was also probably over a decade ago. I spent an afternoon with a man who spent 5 years in Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. He was lifted up off the streets of Pakistan. He was an innocent man. He was tortured there for half a decade. The other meeting then was yesterday, actually. I met a woman who had been able to flee from Afghanistan. She's now in Ireland, but her husband has been detained and he's imprisoned in Pakistan on the way to Ireland. He's been tortured there right now. And his health isn't good. He's been made to lift 60-kilogram bags, bring them up 5 flights of stairs, utterly unnecessarily, it would seem. And the woman herself is really fearful. She's exhausted. She's unable to sleep now. Again, I couldn't help thinking, that, in Ireland, we helped to make Afghanistan into what it is today. So we're all to blame for that. So I'm going to jump back now to 2002. It was when the Western world was in turmoil, of course, after the appalling September 11 attacks in the US. And then Bush and Blair, the rest of them, responded by starting to kill and destroy the lives of countless more people in Afghanistan, as it was, in Iraq and in other places. Their war on terror, they called it. And at the time, I went to Shannon Airport when the warplanes started landing there. And it was mostly in solidarity with the people who were protesting against those warplanes. And there was a peace camp set up, and there were direct actions taken, which I sort of supported, but to some extent from the edges, I suppose. I did take part in February 2003 in the March of 100,000 people in Dublin to oppose the war in Iraq. And that was, you know, quite a moment in many respects. I moved abroad, as it happens, with my family almost immediately after that, just to South Africa. And when we returned, there were rendition planes coming through Shannon, there were armed troops coming through Shannon, there were US Hercules C-130s coming through with God knows what in them. So I then got more active in trying to do something about that. And then reflecting on, you know, as you think about the movement and what's gone on over the years, particularly in terms of opposing US military at Shannon, you know, I've realized it brings together people from different perspectives. You know, the importance of maintaining our neutrality as a means towards maintaining peace, or at least not supporting war or militarization, has been very important, or is very important for some people. Anti-imperialism plays its part. You have, you know, opposition to domination by an external country. Of course, that shouldn't be the same as anti-Americanism, or isn't the same. But Ireland has been turned into a pro-imperialist country in many ways through its support for US foreign policy. So there's certainly opposition to American policy in Ireland, or in the peace movement. And then, of course, there's faith-based opposition to war, and some activists' intentions to prevent further loss of life has led them to take direct action at Shannon. The pit stop ploughshares, the Catholic workers is one that comes to mind. More recently, Dave Donn and Comerford were inspired to take action as well at Shannon. But then, sort of, for me, the starting point has always been human rights. And as Rob mentioned, I work for a human rights and migrant support organisation today. We advocate for the rights of refugees and migrants. And that's why I end up meeting so many people that are affected by war, and why I was talking to the woman from Afghanistan yesterday. And my Shannonwatch activism was also the reason I met the Guantanamo detainee, Murat Kurnaz was his name. I spent the afternoon with him, or an afternoon in Limerick. Next day we went to Shannon, and he knows he was brought shackled in a plane from Kabul to Guantanamo. He knows the plane landed somewhere, probably in Western Europe, but he doesn't know if that was Shannon Airport or not. And we've never been able to ascertain if it was or wasn't. He did ask questions of the Gardaí and the authorities when he was there, and just, you know, and as happens so many times, you know, they just stood stoically and said nothing and wouldn't answer the questions. But yeah, for me, as I said, it's about his human rights and human dignity. It's about everyone's human rights. It's about showing equal regard for everyone, everywhere, wherever they are. But the thing is that, you know, I think, you know, going back to the enormity of the task, I am quite sure that if we weren't all doing what we do in the peace movement in the island of Ireland, we'd be even more complicit in the war industry. You know, Raytheon got booted out of Derry. The Republic hasn't joined NATO. Our Department of Foreign Affairs know they're being watched. I was actually quite amused to find out last year that, along with others, the Department of Justice were monitoring and keeping notes on my social media posts. You know, I actually hope the Department of Foreign Affairs are doing the same. Although it would be better if they acted on what I was saying instead of just counting how many times I said it. Which is
you have a couple of minutes left there, John.
Thanks. Yep. Now, I just finish up by saying that, you know, the last thing, I want to return to the Shannon Peace Vigils. We do these once a month on second Sunday of every month. And I referred there earlier to the different motivations, perspectives there are in the very diverse, sort of often disjointed peace movement we have. And one of the things that often strikes me is that if nothing else, the 20 or more of us that get together on a small roundabout outside Shannon every month, demanding that the US military get out of Shannon, are staying connected with each other. We talk to each other. We mostly believe that we'll succeed. And you know, for me, at the end of the day, that really is something to be celebrated as well. You know, it's not 100,000 people like marched in the streets in Dublin, but it's still a peace movement. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing those insights. And Shannonwatch has been doing an incredible job of monitoring the situation in Shannon, which is, if you like, perhaps the most egregious example of non-neutrality by the Republic. So we look forward to discussions later with our speakers. Unfortunately, in terms of the next speaker, Patrick Comerford is unable to be with us, but he has recorded a video, and I'm hoping that I will now be able to play this and share it with you. The Reverend Canon Professor Patrick Comerford is a former secretary and chair, and he is the current president of Irish CND Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He's a former journalist and retired academic. He's a Church of Ireland priest in County Limerick, where he's involved with ministerial education and training. And unfortunately, he has a work commitment which has necessitated him not being with us this evening. But here's his video.
Good evening. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening because I'm very enthusiastic to share with you many of my experiences with the Irish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Irish CND, over many decades. Irish CND, as we now know it, really dates back to October 1979, but I had been involved in peace protests and non-violent direct action for some time before that. Robb and I would have worked on Dawn magazine. I was involved with the campaign against the arms trade in the 1970s, although that was quite unsuccessful. I organised a protest outside the British Embassy when the police were called, but there were only 3 protesters there, so there was no Garda action needed. That was a lesson in how not to organise direct action. I was also involved in the Carnsore Point sit-ins and was involved in leading some of the workshops there in the 1970s. And then in 1978, I brought together a number of peace groups, I suppose about a dozen or 2 dozen peace groups, to put together a submission to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in advance of the second special session of the United Nations General Assembly on disarmament. And that special session was probably a key moment in generating a lot of interest in Ireland, or reviving a lot of interest at that stage in nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament and Irish government foreign policy. Little did I realise that a year later, in 1979, I was going to spend a full term in Japan on a fellowship that I had been offered. And during that time I visited, I was based in Tokyo, but I visited Hiroshima and met a number of the Hibakusha survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And speaking to them, I asked them what was the one thing they wanted me to do when I went back to Ireland. And they said, please tell them about what has happened. Please tell them so that this should never happen again. So I contacted the CND offices in London immediately when I came back and found out that there were only 6 paid up members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Ireland. And that August I spoke at a workshop at the sit-in at Carnsore at the proposed nuclear power station site in South County Wexford. And I was shocked to realise that very few people realised the implications of a nuclear power station of that type in Ireland at the time, because it would be producing weapons-grade material, weapons-grade uranium, and to a smaller degree weapons-grade plutonium that could be recycled as the byproduct of a nuclear reactor of that sort. So in 1979, I called together the 6 paid-up members of CND in Ireland and asked them what they thought we could do. And some of them had experience from being at the Aldermaston marches in the 1950s and the 1960s, but they weren't a very energetic group of people. But nevertheless, we decided to go ahead and reorganise Irish CND in Ireland. It was fortuitous timing, because within a few months, the West had decided to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles on continental Europe, and the Soviet Union had decided to deploy SS-20 missiles on continental Europe. And this caused a major public reaction right throughout Europe, and we were ready to organise. The protests were phenomenal. People took to the streets against the whole nuclear policy that was that was in a state of evolution throughout the West and the East at the time. And Irish CND grew and grew and grew in a way that I had never imagined it would. So that by 1980, 1981, I was spending many an evening every week just sleeping on other people's floorboards and in their front rooms, as I was involved in travel and trying to organise CND on the ground. Branches grew up. At one stage, we decided to show the film The War Game, Peter Watkins' 1966 movie that had been dropped by the BBC after they had commissioned it. And we packed out one of the largest rooms in Liberty Hall. There were people outside the doors who couldn't get in. So it was a movement that had come at the right time. And we also found that we were there at the right time because there were 2 major visits by Ronald Reagan and Vice President Bush, as he was at the time, to Ireland. The briefcase is coming was the slogan that we used for some of those visits. And an amusing story out of all of this. At one stage, we had a meeting in Cork to organise protests and to coordinate with other protests that were being organised during the Ronald Reagan visit. And on the way back, a large number of us stopped in the Ronald Reagan Inn, which had just been renamed in Ballyporeen in County Tipperary, and spent an hour or 2 in the bar playing at the pool table. And the proprietor got very upset and got very worried and called the guards because he thought here was a protest group who were casing his joint and ready to organise protests and to get into his bar. During the Reagan visits and during the Bush visits, I remember many a night sleeping on the crush barriers that had been put up outside the American embassy. At one stage, following people who had their CIA pin on their lapel, following them through the streets, and it must have been very embarrassing for those poor, untrained people as they came up against what we now regarded ourselves as being seasoned protesters. As CND grew spontaneously in the early 1980s, so that we had trade union CND, women's CND, Christian CND, student CND, branches growing up in every major town and city throughout Ireland, and also in all of the university campuses. One of the groups that was particularly active were the women's group who did not necessarily use the name CND. And a group of women went to Greenham Common, and over the weekend with an Irish flag and an Irish CND banner and a women's CND banner, stood on the silos at Greenham Common to protest against the proposed deployment of cruise missiles on Greenham Common. Their photograph appeared on the front page of the London Times the next day, and one particular activist in Irish CND was very embarrassed and wanted to know how these women were going to respond to the perception of this photograph in the Times, that it would bring down on all of us the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade in the Tory party who wanted to be anti-Irish at every opportunity. Of course, good feminists, good women, they were not going to be controlled by a man like that, and they were successful. The Greenham Common protest is an example of how non-violent direct action actually works. Greenham Common has been returned to being common land, to being open land, and there are no cruise missiles there today. I suppose we've also succeeded in terms of Irish foreign policy on nuclear disarmament. It is exactly where I would have wanted it to have been when that first meeting of 6 Irish CND members was called in the Quaker Meeting House in Dublin in October 1979. I think there are times for movements like this, and the time for Irish CND may come around again. But I'm very glad that we have an example to show in how non-violent direct action works with our protests against Reagan and Bush, against cruise and Pershing missiles, against the SS-20 missiles, against Greenham Common, the way we mobilised churches, students, trade unions, local activists. We have a lesson to learn from how Irish CND worked in organising people in great numbers for non-violent direct action against nuclear weapons. Once again, I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening.
So thank you to Patrick Comerford for his contribution, and as you realise, that was being made by a pre-recorded video. We now move on to our second last speaker, who is Peter Emerson, and he started out in life as a Royal Navy submariner. He then became a founder of CND in Northern Ireland in 1981, and the founder of Bishop's Court Peace Camp in County Down in 1983. He is the director of the De Borda Institute, which promotes the use of inclusive voting procedures, and he has written a stunning 10 books on that subject, on voting procedures. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for organising these 2 seminars, and thank you for inviting me to speak. And thank you also for taking this photograph, which was at Bishop's Court. I think you were the guilty party.
No, I wasn't. No, it might have been Pat. It might have been Larry Spate. I'm not sure. It wasn't me.
I'm going to start in 1991 with John Robb and the New Ireland Group, and we organised a cross-community meeting in Belfast, still a couple of years before the ceasefire. Our guest speaker was Michael D. Higgins, and we were using electronic voting, not bad for 1991, but we were also using preference voting. You can't get a consensus with a majority vote because it only measures dissent, but you can with preference voting. We had another guest speaker there from Sarajevo, and we were trying to say, please don't hold a binary referendum, not in Bosnia, which was 40, 30, 20, Muslim, Orthodox, Catholic. So there was no majority anyway. But nobody was listening. The EU had the Paddington Commission. They insisted on a referendum. It duly took place 6 months later, and within days, Bosnia was at war. So I went there in order to say on my return that majoritarianism doesn't work there either. I got the train to Ljubljana and then cycled to Zagreb. And then I got UN accreditation and hitched a lift with one of the UN relief flights to Sarajevo. And this was December 1992. And so Bosnia, by this stage, had been at war for for 9 months. And there were 3 of us, one guy from Channel 4, English fella, one Croat who was pretending to be a Czech, his translator, which was terribly brave. And we arrived in Sarajevo as it was getting dark and it was cold, -16. And we were driven in an APC to the UN headquarters where the UN said, go away. And the streets were deserted, of course, but we managed to hitch a lift to the Holiday Inn where most journalists were staying. No food, no water, no electricity, no nothing. $70. So the 3 of us thought, well, okay, we'll share. $70 each. So Nicola, the Croat, said, come on, let's go. And yeah, none of us have been to Sarajevo before, but a friend of his parents lived in Sarajevo. So we went out in the night to find this home. And sometime later, we knocked on a door and the old man came and opened, and Nicola said, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm a friend of your son. And, oh, come in, come in. And of course, he hadn't heard anything from his son for 9 months. And we were made welcome. I stayed there for a week. I'd taken some food from Zagreb, some cheese and stuff. And I gave this to, well, tried to give it to Nada and Martin, but they refused to take it. So I lived, as they did, on UN rations, cup of tea in the morning, and a bit of spaghetti soup in the evening. And before I left, I wasn't going to take this food back to Zagreb, so I hid it under the mattress. And then from Zagreb, I set off on my bicycle. There are 3 krajinas, or there were in Croatia, areas like Northern Ireland, where they're mainly Serbs, mainly Orthodox people. And I was given permission to go from Zagreb to Belgrade. I wasn't really meant to go into the krajina, but I thought I would anyway. And once I was in the krajina, I thought, well, I'll go and have a look at the border. I know I'm not allowed into Bosnia, but I'll go and have a look at the border anyway. And just before I got there, I bumped into this old boy on a bicycle who doubtless thought that I deserved the same description. And oh, dobar dan, and we started chatting. And then we got to the river, which was the bridge, and it was crowded with UN personnel looking out, protecting it and so on. So we said, dobar dan, and I was in. So I went straight to Banja Luka and got another accreditation so that I could roam around. And I did, and I cycled from Banja Luka through the corridor near Brčko, and then on my way to Belgrade, spent a few days there, and then came back in Zvornik and down to Pale, which is a little village just outside Sarajevo, which they regarded as their capital. And then I did probably the craziest thing I've ever done, which is to cycle across the front line onto the airport. And I was back in Sarajevo again. So I went to Martin and Nada. And of course, I hadn't been able to tell them that I was on my way back. I just knocked on the door, and Nada came and opened and looked at me, oi Timoi, like a mother to a long-lost child. So a few more days in the Federation, and then I went down to Mostar, crossed this bridge, and a few days later it was blown up, and then home. And I said, majoritarianism doesn't work there either. But apart from Robb and a couple of others, nobody was listening. I've been back to Bosnia and the Balkans quite a few times, sometimes as an OSCE observer for the elections and sometimes conferences and things. And 3 years ago, I was on my way to China and so I went through Sarajevo and I gave a lecture at the university in Serbo-Croat, actually, which I was quite proud of until the nice professor, after about 20 minutes, he said, well, maybe I would like to carry on in English. And then afterwards, I went to see Nada. And Martin died a couple of years ago, so she's now a widow, but she has a lodger, a young girl who was born after the war. And Nada and I recalled those bitter days, but often with laughter. And then 2 years later, I was back in Sarajevo again for a book launch. And this is my friend Valerie. She's American, but she lives there permanently. And this is mine, and that was hers. And then from Georgia, from Bosnia, I went to Georgia, which is another conflict zone which has suffered from majoritarianism. And I was first there in 1990. I gave a press conference in Tbilisi and on power sharing. 1 year later, Georgia got its independence under a very majoritarian Gamsakhurdia. And then 1 year later again, and Abkhazia was at war. So I went there as well, and time enough to say that, well, on the way back from Sukhumi, I don't often fly, but I did on this occasion. And it was just an ordinary 40-seater short-haul aircraft. But on this ordinary 40-seater short-haul aircraft, there was the extraordinary number of 80 passengers. But that's what happens in wars. And then I was in Tbilisi again 2 years ago, on my way, as I say, to China, overland. And I got a minibus taxi from Tbilisi across the border into Russia. Beautiful journey across the Caucasus Mountains. And then I was detained in Russia by the Russian authorities because they don't like NGOs very much, a bit like the media and academia here. And they certainly don't like NGOs that campaign against majoritarianism, the Russian word for which is Bolshevism. Thank you very much.
Okay, if you can, thank you, Peter, and if you can end your screen sharing, that's great, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for sharing those insights from around some conflict areas of Europe. Our final speaker, who is on the move and is having to join us by phone, we're hoping that she will be able to contribute her talk as normal, and I will show her slides. Sylvia Thompson is a speech and language therapist by profession. She's worked and studied in various countries, including Ireland, Canada, and Peru, and she's now a full-time volunteer. She was very involved with Pax Christi while living in Belfast, and she's now living in Tralee in County Kerry since 1994, and she's involved with the Diocese of Kerry Justice, Peace and the Integrity of Creation Committee, the Laudato Si Working Group, Kerry Sustainable Energy Cooperative, and other groups, especially in the areas of spirituality, biodiversity and inclusion. Sylvia was up in Dublin today, and unfortunately she is still, for us, that she's still traveling home and on the train. So I don't know, Sylvia, if how, you can see how it goes anyway, and I'll bring up your slideshow when you want me to. Over to you, Sylvia.
Rob. Okay, thank you. And have I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Good. So I'm now in Killarney, in fact. So the next stop is Farranfore, and then it's Tralee. So it's been an interesting journey, and a really interesting journey to listen to all the four speakers before me and to notice all the threads that unite us. So I moved to Tralee in 1994. Not sure, should I move? Did I want to move? I was kind of heartbroken and all of those things. As I drove down the motorway with my cat crying, the first ceasefire was announced. It was the 31st of August, 94. Someone said, why don't you turn around now? It's just getting good. But I kept going to what I presumed really was a very different world where I would be completely untouched by anything that had been part of my life in Northern Ireland. But if you show now the first slide, Rob,
yep.
Because it's really a definition of ecology. I actually can't read it now, so Rob might be able to read it for me when it comes up.
Okay.
Because you can read it there, Rob.
Yes, ecology, the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms, includes humans to one another and to their physical surroundings.
And so I began to realize that, in fact, as time went on, maybe my life wasn't all that different, because I was still relating to all of these humans in different physical surroundings, but now probably relating more to organisms. And in that picture, it's not me. like the man from the Ruslimini, whose name is John, I think, I'm also working with the Tralee equivalent, which is the Tralee International Resource Centre, and should be an English teacher there tomorrow. And I'm on the board of what we call Turk. And this is a woman from Venezuela who has now got her papers. As you know, Venezuela went up in smoke, essentially. So she's got her papers and living in a funny little flat in a little street in Tralee. And I had brought her for a walk to Killarney. And as soon as we got into, just actually the golf course near Lieber's car park, she ran over and hugged this tree. And I realized how starved she was of just being able to relate to another organism. So my life had changed, but maybe not changed so much, because when I moved to live in my country area, a little bit outside Tralee, unlike Michael, who spoke to us last week, I discovered that I was living in a very twin track community. In my parish, my physical parish, there were 2 Catholic churches and 2 churches of Ireland, or Protestant churches. There wasn't what I would call sectarianism. There was simply 2 parallel communities. And when I began to try to make a few little bridges between these, and went, for example, to talk to my parish priest, the parish priest said, I don't know any of those strange people. And I explained to him that maybe if he got to know them, he might discover they weren't really so strange. And indeed, that was what happened. We discovered that they weren't really so strange, because I was missing a whole part of my life when I wasn't with a more pluralist community. So the next slide brings up Transition Kerry, I think. Is that what it brings up?
Justice, peace and integrity of creation.
Oh, yes, okay. Even though I had kind of tried to rehearse this. So I haven't tried to make a little bit of noise about peace, because I suppose I thought Tralee was a place that really was at peace, but I, of course, discovered that it too was a very divided place where the best thing to talk about is to talk about nothing. And so I discovered that I was in my little local area. One of my neighbours' house was a safe house, and another house down the road was another safe house. And coming with a funny name like I did, people were trying to work out who I was and what foot did I kick with.
Can you explain what a safe house is in that context, Sylvia, a bit more?
Well, yeah, a safe house, well, maybe to say that when some of the sheds were being demolished in the house next door, they were calling in the army because it probably would have contained a lot of arms, and people on the run would have been in these houses. And the people who still lived in them still adhered to the same politics. And the Civil War is, of course, never far away. In fact, it's only yesterday, really. Civil War and more independence really getting quite blurred. So I discovered too that people may remember there was a terrible atrocity on the border where a body was dumped. 4 people had been fishing in a fishing village called Feenet, where I like to go for a walk now. And the word was passed up the line, and they were stopped as soon as they went over the border. They let the 3 policemen, prison officers go, but they killed the policeman. So I realized things were not quite so peaceful as they appeared initially. And so I started, I suppose, making a little bit of noise about peace. And as a result of that, I got invited to join this justice group that was starting at the beginning of the millennium. So maybe 89, no, not 89, but when was the millennium? I moved in 94, so it was about 98, 99. We became a justice group, then we became Justice and Peace, and finally we became Justice, Peace and the Integrity of Creation. And indeed had a little vigil in the cathedral when Ronald Reagan came, when we had a Jewish man, an Islamic man, a Baha'i man, and various Christian denominations all came together. It wasn't anti-Reagan, even though we were interviewed, but we were for peace and for truth, and for none of that other stuff that was obviously going on. So I've been still with that group, but you can see there's sculpture And the sculpture is the work of a man called Ronan Halpen. And it portrays the first Irish poet, who's called Amergin. Amergin is possibly mythological in character, it's hard to know. He came in off the sea down at Waterville. And this is a statue, and that's the words of his poetry, our first Irish poem. Sometimes we seem to think in the Green Movement we have to achieve Seattle, but I think Amergin is actually more of a native and homegrown. And I have found that moving into culture is a great way to link people. This links me a little bit to my next slide, which is about which is about Peru, I think, is it?
Transition
No,
Kerry.
I'm not sure which.
Transition Kerry.
Transition Kerry. Yeah, Transition Kerry. You can see my good eye is patched. So Transition Kerry was this group that had been these public talks. So I used to go along to them because they were all very interesting. And they talked about energy, and they talked about food sovereignty that I'd never heard of. They talked about transport, and they talked about resilience, and all of these things that seemed to me very important. And we were all very interested in all of these. And I joined little groups to explore all of these, and I began to grow all my own vegetables, well, some of them. And I realized that living in my community, I was kind of living at a superficial level, even with regard to the soil. So I began to get a little bit greener on one level, and realizing I knew so little, even though I had very good tutors in Northern Ireland, in the person of Peter and in the person of Robb himself, because on one stage in my life in the north, my father came to live with me. And I remember he wandered around the corner for a cup of tea in Peter Emerson's house, to my great surprise. And I said later, "What did you do?" He said, "Well, he asked me, would I like a cup of tea?" And he said, yes. But having said that, Peter immediately went out of the room and brought back a bush and put the bush inside the teapot. And I said, "What was the tea like?" And he said it was very nice. So that was an unusual experience for my father. So I had very good tutors about growing.
You have a couple of minutes left there, Sylvia, if that's okay.
So the last one takes me to Peru. And when you go to Peru, you'll see there's a lot of people in Peru. There was a lot of pollution. There was a lot of poverty. There was very little clean water. And there was something else. There's probably another word there too that I can't really see now. And this was another eye-opener because, of course, I went in a sense as a volunteer, as a missionary. And one of the first instances was there was something to do with racism. And I thought, who is there in Peru to be racist against or for or about? So, of course, I discovered all the other layers in Peru as well, including the layer of people trafficking that was alive and well, mining, deforestation, and the name of Roger Casement being somebody who was very important in Peru, which finally brings me to my last slide, I think, which is about post-COP. Because last night, before I left for Dublin, I was hearing about the 5 asks of a petition, which did not include the armaments, to my shock and to my horror. So I can see something has been left out of my equation. So when the Indian man said, listen, we'll change the word from phasing down. No. We'll not phase out. No, we'll go to phase down. I realized the amount of work that we had to do. And there is so much work that we have to do. And I think tomorrow I will contact the Department of Foreign Affairs to register my concern about the arms trade or the arms exhibition going on online. And thanks to everybody who has contributed to my journey so far and for this permission to speak. Thank you, Rob, and everybody else.
I'd like to express my thanks to Sylvia for joining us on the day of a medical procedure and also on the move. So Sylvia, thank you very much for making that effort to join us as you could. I would like to, before we move into the discussion mode and allow people to choose their discussion group. I would like us to show our appreciation to all the speakers by raising a hand and giving everybody a wave and saying thank you everybody for sharing so many different insights. And the seminar will now continue with discussion groups, but I will stop sharing at this point. I'll stop recording, sorry, at this point, and then we'll divide up into discussion groups.